Morning, everybody. The man I'm introducing this morning, Alan Cornett, is a man out of time, and I mean that genuinely. He is a man that is so Chestertonianly unique, the unique individual who stands apart from society right now, but lives in it, and other people want to be like him, but don't have the courage, okay? Alan is a native of Clay County, Kentucky. He's a reader of the Southern Agrarians. A lot of people don't even know what that is. It's a thing. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Kentucky, a master's degree from the University of South Carolina. He's a friend of Wendell Berry's and organized Wendell Berry's library, and was just recently visiting Wendell on a Sunday afternoon at his house. He is the host of the Cultural Debris podcast. He is my co-host, or I co-host with Alan, the Cultural Debris Excursions. And if any of you remember reading Dale's article from a couple of issues ago about that trip, they had a wonderful time. You can ask Laura or Adrian about it as well. He's a master thrifter of books, clothes, barrister bookcases. And he did a wonderful job finding Adrian Alquist something on the order of a $2,000 Italian suit for about $100. Adrian just needs to do a little bit of taking it in there. Alan was also Russell Kirk's assistant. And there's nobody better here to talk about Russell Kirk and G.K. Chesterton than my friend Alan Cornett.
Gentleman on the second row here pointed out that 5 minutes ago he could still get a seat up front. I told him in 15 minutes the place may be empty. So I'm here this morning to talk about one of the 20th century's most prescient authors, a man who wrote dozens of books, one who edited journals, wrote regular newspaper columns, but who many know as a writer of fiction, completely unaware he primarily wrote serious nonfiction. My subject came from humble origins, but rose to be a celebrated public intellectual, friends with many of the leading literary lights of his day. He was known to dress somewhat flamboyantly and entertain his friends with long yarns around a fire. At the height of his fame, and after publishing many of his most important books, upholding a Christian moral order, he converted to Catholicism in his 40s. Obviously, everybody here at the Chesterton Conference will immediately recognize that I'm talking about Russell Kirk of Mecosta, Michigan, the subject of my talk this morning. I want to thank my friend and colleague Tom Ruby for the very kind, overly kind remarks. I told him only to say good things about me in order to keep his introduction short. I also want to thank Dale Alquist for the kind invitation to speak to you. He met me last year at my very first Chesterton conference, and somewhat buying a pig in a poke, he asked me to speak this year. And after getting to know me a little bit better in Genoa, he didn't rescind the invitation, so I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to talk to you about Russell Kirk today. The opportunity to speak to you this morning, to me, especially talking to you about Russell Kirk, from my point of view, is clearly a providential opportunity. I see the story of Russell Kirk as one of echoed conversions, the story of a man who was born far from the church, who ended up in the church in his 40s, just as Chesterton himself did decades before. And this story is told to you by someone who was born far from the church and who entered the church in his 40s, although just barely. My own conversion certainly was due in large part to my association with Russell Kirk, both through his writings and through the time I spent with him as an assistant. It was through Dr. Kirk that I first discovered G.K. Chesterton and began reading him decades ago. And to cap that off, it was through watching hours of Bishop Robert Barron discuss and show the beauty of Catholicism through his series, watching his pivotal players episodes on Chesterton and Newman and Flannery O'Connor. Those things helped push me to my own conversion not 3 years ago. So it's extraordinary to me that I could be speaking at a conference dedicated to G.K. Chesterton about Russell Kirk, and I actually got to meet Bishop Robert Barron and speak to him last night. So those are tremendous things for me personally, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate you kicking off this morning with me. I am a little bit at a disadvantage because I'm following Dale Ahlquist and Bishop Robert Barron. So I think Dale's philosophy was, well, this will make us look a lot better. It was 32 years ago as an undergraduate at the University of Kentucky that I sent letters, and for those of you who are younger, these were actual typed letters that were placed in an envelope. I put stamps on them, and I put them in a mailbox, and off they went. And you didn't know when someone was going to write you back, or even if they would. And I sent these letters to Russell Kirk and to William F. Buckley, Jr. of National Review. And I asked them, as a naive young undergraduate, if I could interview them for my undergraduate thesis. Both of them replied and said yes. Buckley sent along a reading assignment of several books so that I wouldn't come to him with redundant questions. He said, make sure you read all these, because a lot of this stuff I've already answered, and I don't want to waste time with that. He was very kind, though. It was a great opportunity to meet with him. I had a blocked off time, and I interviewed him in the National Review library. But then he was off doing William F. Buckley things after that. Russell Kirk, however, kindly invited me to come to his home in Mecosta, Michigan, and spend a long weekend. That was an incredible act of generosity. He had no idea who I was, other than somebody who wrote him a letter kind of out of the blue. I didn't really know a lot about Russell Kirk other than the fact that he was instrumental in the post-World War II conservative movement, about which I was writing my thesis. And that's why I wanted to talk to him and Buckley. They were the focus of my undergraduate thesis. And honestly, one of the reasons, this is how the undergraduate mind thinks, one of the reasons I wanted to go interview them was because the program I was with, I learned, had money for travel research. And I thought, well, I need to find something to do so I can tap into that money. So they paid for my plane flights up to see them. It worked well. It worked well for me. I imagined Russell Kirk was living in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, in this kind of hermit-like existence. I did have the middle of nowhere, Michigan part right. And I know some of you have visited Mecosta, Michigan, and it's one of those places that you have to intend to go to. You don't just pass through Mecosta. But there was a towering brick Italianate house, complete with cupola. There was a separate library building with 15,000 books. There were multiple houses around the main house, and there were young assistants, young men and women who were often between undergraduate and graduate school, sort of in those in-between years of studies. And they would go there, and they would help Russell and Annette, and they would work and study on different topics of their choosing. The Kirks did not recruit or advertise for assistants. They operated under the belief that assistants would be providentially provided for them. The right people would come. And I would later realize that while I thought I was in Mecosta to interview Russell Kirk, I was actually myself on a multi-day job interview to be an assistant. which was a job I didn't even know existed until I got up there. And following the weekend, the Kirks asked if I would be interested in serving as an assistant the following year. And we have another former Kirk assistant here this weekend, Robert Roach, fellow Kentuckian. I was surprised to run into him last night, and it was always good to see a Kirkian. I also met such people as Amy and William Fahey, he of the Troubadour fame. William was also an assistant for Russell Kirk. Amy was an assistant before I was. William was an assistant after I was. I would spend hours discussing religion with the loquacious Annette Kirk in the Kirk kitchen. And it was a pivotal moment in my life, to be sure, and without that time, there's no question I would not be here with you now. Of course, I treasure the time I spent with Dr. Kirk, assisting him in the library, chauffeuring him wherever he wanted to go. He did not drive and considered automobiles mechanical Jacobins, he said. And so anywhere we would go, he would refuse to ride on the freeway or the interstate, which he also hated. And this was, of course, long before there was such a thing as GPS or cell phones. And we would go the back roads of Michigan, and he would just sort of spontaneously say, "Turn here." And I had no idea where we were. But then he and I may end up at some remote German restaurant that he wanted to go to eat dinner. Dr. Kirk did not do fast food. Russell Kirk was reserved and somewhat shy by temperament. It was interesting last night in the moments I got to speak with Bishop Barron. The primary question he asked me was, what was he like when I told him I was an assistant for Russell Kirk? He wanted to know. He loved to tell stories, and of course, as we'll talk about, wrote those down. And he was always ready with a dry quip. My friend and fellow assistant David Abner said Dr. Kirk was the funniest person he ever met per word spoken. He didn't talk a lot, but when he did, you paused and thought, that was absolutely hilarious, and you were laughing. But who was Russell Kirk? I know many of you know him well through his writings and his reputation. Many of you will have heard of him, and I know some of you have no idea why I'm even up here this morning. Why is there a talk about this guy at a Chesterton conference? As I tell the Kirk story and share some particular highlights, and of course the story is far too vast to cover in an encyclopedic way for me up here. But my hope is that you will see the thread of growing intellectual and spiritual appreciation of Chesterton in Kirk's life and thought and his writings, and that you may also find this talk as a gateway to exploring Kirk's own writings and thoughts. Russell Kirk burst onto the American scene at the age of 35 in 1953 with the publication of The Conservative Mind, a survey of and synthesis of conservative Anglo-American writers, as the subtitle explained, From Burke to Santayana. Later editions would replace Santayana as the survey's endpoint with T.S. Eliot, the American expatriate poet who would become friends with Kirk and serve as his British editor at Faber and Faber. Kirk would later write a book on Eliot called Eliot and His Age, and it's one of probably the three great Kirk nonfiction books. The Conservative Mind was an adaptation of Kirk's doctoral dissertation at St. Andrews University in Scotland and was originally called The Conservative's Route, a less than encouraging title. The Conservative Mind was the book that gave the post-war conservative movement its name. The book was a sensation. It was featured by Time magazine, reviewed in the New York Times, and reviewed by the likes of Whittaker Chambers, who was at the height of his own fame at the time. Fortune magazine called it a landmark. It made Kirk a literary celebrity, at least in part because, from the viewpoint of those who were running these publications, who would dare defend conservatism on an intellectual basis? That was just not something that happened. Kirk's conservatism was not a statement of partisan politics. It's hard for us to think of it in those terms. Of course, that's a very Chestertonian way of understanding it, But when people hear conservative, they immediately start thinking partisan politics, but that was not Russell Kirk's mindset at all. It was a way of thinking. It was a cast of mind. He outlined a series of canons of conservative thought, and first among those was belief that a divine intent rules society as well as conscience, forging an eternal chain of right and duty with links great and obscure, living and dead. Political problems at bottom are religious and moral problems, Kirk wrote. I think we can see a lot of G.K. Chesterton breathing through that statement of principle. This conservatism of Kirk's was a rejection of reason, and that's reason with a capital R, the sort of reason one might have stumbled across in France circa 1789. Kirk continued, human reason set up a cross on Calvary. Human reason set up the cup of hemlock. And second in those canons, Kirk said, affection for the proliferating variety and mystery of traditional life. Kirk despised systems and programs, a belief in regularity, and most of all, ideology, which he considered secularized religion built upon abstract principles created by human reason. An ideology was, as Kirk quoted his intellectual master Edmund Burke, an armed doctrine. It is in the conservative mind that we find Kirk's first mention of G.K. Chesterton, and this is from the very early editions of the conservative mind. He said, writers like Chesterton and Belloc, though outside the true line of descent in conservative ideas, though sentimentally democratic and economically fanciful, did more to nourish the old conservative impulse during those dark times than did the men who should have carried the tradition of Burke. Distributism, however involved with individualistic fallacies, offered more of an answer to the ills of modern life than did the pensions and doles of the conservative and liberal and labor parties. Orthodoxy, in some sort, echoed the ideals of Coleridge and Newman. The servile state reflected the postulates of Bolingbroke and Disraeli. But Belloc and Chesterton were only auxiliaries of conservatism. Where were the strategoi? As we can see, early Kirk appreciated Chesterton, but he did so in a reserved way. He did not fully embrace him at this point. Why? I think much of it had to do with Kirk's own religious status. If Chesterton was an auxiliary of conservatism, Kirk at the time was an auxiliary of Christianity. He appreciated it, but he really didn't consider himself a Christian. He considered himself a Stoic to the degree he considered himself anything. And of course, that would change over time. Kirk's critique of distributism is interesting here, as Kirk was very much a localist and an admirer of the 12 agrarians who wrote I'll Take My Stand, the American cousin of distributism. Kirk was particularly an admirer of the agrarian poet and writer Donald Davidson, with whom he became friends. Certainly, Kirk would show more affinity for distributism as time passed, and I think would have identified himself as such in his later years. It was during this period of growing fame that Kirk got into a feud with his employer, the president of Michigan State University, which was also his alma mater, his undergraduate alma mater. Kirk was a professor of history, and at that time was one of the biggest celebrities that the university had because of the conservative mind. But Kirk vehemently opposed this new concept of survey classes that they had instituted, these large gatherings of perhaps hundreds of students, and all of us have been in survey classes, I suspect, or at least most of us have been cursed with them. It was a new thing at one time, and Kirk didn't like it, and they were developed to churn through the glut of students that came to the university through the GI Bill. Kirk derisively dubbed Michigan State Behemoth U. This put the president in a bit of a spot because here Kirk is making these public pronouncements, by the way. This was not a private complaint. Kirk was being very vocal about this. And at the time had a big platform, but at the same time, he's sort of the star professor that Michigan State had. Eventually, a frustrated Kirk would resign from Michigan State and remove to Mecosta, Michigan, his ancestral home. Although raised in Plymouth, Michigan, it is in Mecosta that he spent summers as a boy. He would live in Mecosta for the next 40 years, the rest of his life, as an independent man of letters, refusing university appointments to maintain his freedom. Kirk was still a bachelor then and lived a bachelor's life, sleeping during the day and writing at night. He was always a night owl. And I remember one night, it was a snowy night, and of course it's Michigan. It was a snowy night. I was living in the house beside the library, and I was living the life essentially of a college student still. And so I was up late and was running over to the library to do some chore that I had put off and needed to take care of. And I walked out of the door and caught something out of the corner of my eye, and I looked over, and in the moonlight on the snow was the silhouette of Russell Kirk. And he had been in the library late at night writing, and he was trundling off back to the main house. That was in his 70s. But that was the life that he set up for himself. He was always a night owl. His aunt still lived in the old home called Piety Hill by the locals. And that was a name that had gone back generations because Kirk's ancestors had been teetotalers. And so the locals had made fun of them by calling the house Piety Hill. It was a name given in derision, but one Kirk would enthusiastically embrace. And so it's still called Piety Hill by the Kirks. Kirk set up living in a small brick building down the street. That was the library I was talking about. Kirk essentially moved into that library. He would sleep upstairs. It had originally been a toy factory, a little small local toy factory built years before. And Kirk turned it into a library and his office. And he would stay there and I suppose go eat dinner with his aunts down the street. But he would sleep all day, write at night. And it was during this time that Kirk was recruited by a young William F. Buckley Jr., who wanted to start a new magazine he would call National Review. And so Buckley traveled to Mecosta. And it's interesting because William F. Buckley Sr. wrote to Russell Kirk before William F. Buckley Jr. came to see him and basically said, "Hey, my son wants to come see you. If you could, please look after him when he's there." He went to Mecosta to woo Kirk to write for the magazine because Kirk's name would lend credibility to the new venture. Kirk agreed and would write for National Review for the next quarter century. Buckley gives us some insight into Russell Kirk with this anecdote that he shared in his obituary for Dr. Kirk. In the ensuing 25 years, he never missed a deadline. At his wedding to the woman his readers resigned themselves finally to acknowledge as the beauteous Annette, I thought that possibly the most useful gift I might give him would be a honeymoon's length moratorium from his column since he was off to Scotland. I stammered out the proposal to him moments before he ascended to the altar. He acknowledged it by reaching into the pocket of his morning coat and presenting me with 4 columns. Perfectly typed, perfectly edited, perfectly executed. Not many had more direct, week-by-week knowledge of the extraordinary professionalism of Russell Kirk, which matched that, Buckley says, of Samuel Johnson and G.K. Chesterton. It was also during Kirk's bachelor days of the 1950s that Kirk met Flannery O'Connor at the home of Brainerd and Fanny Chaney near Nashville in October of 1955. Kirk and O'Connor were both house guests, although Kirk did not know she was going to be there when he arrived. He writes that at the time he had read nothing of hers, but the two formed an immediate connection despite their mutual shyness. Flannery was struck by the meeting as well, and she described Kirk in a letter as looking like, quote, Humpty Dumpty intact. Humpty Dumpty intact with constant cigar and, outside, pork pie hat. Kirk would only learn of this letter and her description after her death and the letter's publication, but he delighted in the Humpty Dumpty description. Consider what a timeless moment it would have been that night at the Cheneys as Kirk heard Flannery O'Connor read aloud "A Good Man is Hard to Find," still then a new story. Kirk wrote of the encounter in the third person, as he often did. He said, "They seemed to agree on everything, she from the Milledgeville farm, he from the old judge's house at Mecosta. Although Kirk's junior in years, she was in advance of him. When Flannery died in 1964, Kirk, then 45 years old, had begun to apprehend truths that Miss O'Connor had discerned at the age of 30. Kirk even wrote to his friend and editor T.S. Eliot that he ought to read O'Connor. Eliot replied that he had seen a book of her stories in New York and, quote, was quite horrified by those I read. My nerves are just not strong enough to take that much of a disturbance." But Kirk reveled in her stories, writing again here in the third person. Kirk well understood her fantastic and her depraved characters, their twisted faith, and all because precisely such people lived about him in Mecosta County. They emerged repeatedly in his own stories, many of those written long before he met Miss O'Connor, and which presumably she never saw. Kirk wrote in his posthumously published autobiography, The Sword of the Imagination, "Beyond time, we two, who met but once, may be enfolded in the community of souls." As Kirk alluded to in his recollection of O'Connor, he too was a writer of fiction. While Kirk's 24 books on history, politics, and literature are what we usually emphasize now, Kirk's biggest selling book is not The Conservative Mind, but rather Old House of Fear, a novel which has sold more copies than all of his other books combined. Released in 1961, Kirk described the book as a, quote, Gothic romance. Kirk, of course, does not mean a romance story like a Harlequin romance, but rather a novel in the tradition of Sir Walter Scott. Scott's Waverley novels were a lifelong favorite of Kirk's. He read through them multiple times in his life and told me that the Waverley novels had influenced his thinking as much as anything. In total, Kirk wrote some 20 short stories and 3 novels, which pale beside his nonfiction in quantity, certainly. But although his total output of fiction was relatively small, it is quite highly regarded. No less of an authority on the ghostly tale than Stephen King listed Kirk's short story collection, The Princess of All Lands, in his top 100 recommended books. Kirk's friend Ray Bradbury wrote, for too many years, Russell Kirk remained half seen in the American literary scene. He deserves to be considered a fine writer and an amazing thinker in literature and in politics. Kirk's short story, There's a Long, Long Trail A-Winding, won the World Fantasy Award for Best Short Fiction in 1977. Kirk based the main character on a real-life hobo, a self-educated transient named Clinton Wallace, who the Kirk family adopted as a kind of handyman and friend of the family when he was around. He would sometimes just disappear for months at a time and then show back up again. Wallace was a giant of a man who would declaim long poems to the Kirks, which he had memorized in libraries over the years. The Kirk served as Wallace's parole sponsor when he was arrested in Pennsylvania for breaking into a church poor box. Wallace's defense was, who else would poor box funds be meant for than someone such as himself? He has a point, I feel. Wallace was also inadvertently responsible for burning down the original Piety Hill home at midnight on Ash Wednesday, 1975, when Kirk was away. His family was home, but Kirk was away lecturing on T.S. Eliot's poem Ash Wednesday. In the story, There's a Long, Long Trail A-Winding, the main character, Frank Sarsfield, stumbles across an abandoned house that turns out to be startlingly hospitable to him. As with many of Kirk's stories, Sarsfield finds himself in a liminal space and is offered an unexpected chance at sacrifice and personal redemption. I recommend that you read the story, but you can also go on YouTube, and there is a video. It doesn't show Dr. Kirk, but you can listen to him read this story, which is a wonderful thing to hear his voice. It's a perfect thing to do in October, which was Kirk's favorite month, because not only was it the month of his birth, but he also loved Halloween. Dr. Kirk was visibly excited by the celebration of Halloween during my time at Mecosta. The house was enthusiastically decorated. On Halloween night, we had a party and also opened the home up for trick-or-treaters. Now, the Kirk home looks haunted in the noonday sun in July. Imagine being a young trick-or-treater in the dark of Halloween approaching the house to ask for candy. Many a kid lost his nerve on the way up and turned back to the car. One wide-eyed, brave young soul who had made it into the Kirk foyer timidly asked Dr. Kirk, who was dressed in costume as the Wizard of Mecosta, "Do you live here?" "When we were alive, we did," Dr. Kirk. Dr. Kirk answered, But back to the fiction. Kirk explains his philosophy of spooky stories in his essay, A Cautionary Note on the Ghostly Tale, which you can find on the Kirk Center website, all sorts of resources there. He writes, unlike the true narration, the fictional ghostly tale can possess a plot, theme, and purpose. It can piece together in some pattern the hints which seem thrown out by this vision or that haunting or some case of second sight. It can touch keenly upon the old reality of evil and upon injustice and retribution. It can reveal aspects of human conduct and longing to which the positivistic psychologist has blinded himself. And it still can be a first-rate yarn. Kirk began writing short stories while still a student at St. Andrews and was shocked to discover how well British periodicals paid at the time. Kirk was largely living hand-to-mouth as a poor student in Scotland in the late 1940s. One of his strategies was to join every extracurricular group on campus because they would have events with food. And so he would go to eat the free food, and in many days he would only eat one meal a day because he simply didn't have any money. But his fiction, published during this period in such outlets as the London Mystery Magazine, essentially paid for his living expenses during the last several years of his time in St. Andrews. Like Chesterton's fiction, it is best not to dismiss Kirk's fiction as mere entertainment, although Kirk, like Chesterton, believed they certainly ought to be entertaining. Kirk's interest in the supernatural was certainly, at least in part, spurred by his own ancestors' interest in spiritualism, and there was sort of a lingering interest in his family in that. Piety Hill was the scene of many a seance around the turn of the previous century. The house was haunted by ghosts, known and unknown, until it burned on that Ash Wednesday night. Kirk himself had seen the ghosts, and even his children experienced them. I spent one of the most anxiety-filled nights of my life when I stayed in the guest room known as the Gothic Room in the Kirk home when everyone else was gone. So the Kirks were traveling on a speaking trip. And Annette said, "You've got to come and stay in the house while we're gone to watch over things." So I was the only person in the house and on any of the property. And although I never saw a ghost, I was convinced it was going to happen, and I don't know if I would have been even any more frightened had I seen one. Kirk was convinced there was something more than the materialistic and rationalistic world that was embraced by modernity. His life and writings were a rejection of those things, but Kirk's own background was not explicitly Christian. His family was loving and moral, but not religious. It was when Kirk served in Utah during World War II that he had plenty of time to consider his beliefs and to begin his journey to the church. Kirk spent the entire war in Utah, and his primary role was, after they would bomb these little fake cities that they would build, to see how well the bombs work, and Kirk was somebody who was sent in to write up reports on what the damage was like. So he was protected from any action during World War II. He writes, "Here it was that I commenced very languidly to move from my stoicism towards something more. It was not towards pantheism that I moved, for the rattlesnake, the lizard, the gray sagebrush, and the bitter juniper berry do not inspire Wordsworth's love of divine handiwork. Yet the consciousness of a brooding presence stirred in me, something of the desert prophet whose name I bore. Amos is Russell Kirk's middle name. Something of the desert prophet whose name I bore, rather, as Chesterton says in another context, like rousing a great wild forest passion in a little cockney heart. It was here in the desert that young Kirk pondered the great questions of life. He writes, he perceived the limitations and frontiers of pure reason. He became aware of his own inclinations, and they were not in concert with the spirit of the age. Kirk writes, mine was not an enlightened mind, capital E, enlightened. Mine was not an enlightened mind, I was now aware. It was a Gothic mind, medieval in its temper and structure. I did not love cold harmony and perfect regularity of organization. What I sought was variety, mystery, tradition, the venerable, the awful. I despised sophisters and calculators. I was groping for faith, honor, and prescriptive loyalties. I would have given any number of neoclassical pediments for one poor battered gargoyle. It was this mindset that would produce the conservative mind, an old house of fear, and would eventually lead him to Christianity in the church. In 1960, Russell Kirk, then 41, met a young Catholic girl from Long Island named Annette Courtbanch, who was giving a talk on Kirk's book, The American Cause, prior to his own scheduled speech at this event. Kirk was stunned by the girl, and he was smitten. She was 19. The two began corresponding, although both were extremely conscious of the age difference. After a four-year-long distance courtship, Annette wrote to Russell, I have decided that our marriage is inevitable. He responded, like death and taxes. The two would be married in September 1964, but not before a necessary step by Kirk. Russell Kirk was baptized and confirmed into the Catholic Church in August 1964 at 45 years of age. Kirk had long written for Catholic publications such as Commonweal in America, as well as Catholic-adjacent publications. I think those publications were a little different then. Kirk wrote of his conversion, some readers assumed that Kirk must be Catholic. So it came to pass that few were much startled when in 1964 Kirk would be received into the Catholic Church. In 1992, William F. Buckley sent out a questionnaire to a group of 9 Catholic acquaintances, including Kirk, as Buckley prepared for what would become his book, Nearer My God. Kirk's lengthy reply is published in full in his selected letters called Imaginative Conservatism. In answer to Buckley's question about what unique feature drew him to the Catholic Church, Kirk responded, what I found in the church was authority. Catholicism is governed by authority, Protestants by private judgment. Kirk continues, I was not converted, in quotation marks, to the church, but made my way into it through what Newman calls elation, fragments of truth collecting in my mind through personal experience, conversations, knowledge of exemplars, and much reading and meditating. And in answer to Buckley's question if the ride to conversion was bumpy, Kirk said no. The ride was untroubled. It sufficed me to reflect that great and good men over the centuries, I thought of Samuel Johnson in particular, had examined Christian orthodoxy and found it good. Who was I to dissent from their judgments? Sir Thomas Browne, too, was among my favorite apologists, and C.S. Lewis, and Chesterton, and Father Martin Darcy. Kirk admitted the principal obstacle to my submission was my invincible indolence. Here we find Kirk appreciating Chesterton in a different way than he had in years past. Chesterton is numbered among Kirk's favorite apologists. Of course, this written 2 years before Kirk's death, but he's looking back in time to the moment of his conversion or his reception into the church. And it certainly seems that Kirk's interest in Chesterton was ignited during this time leading up to Kirk's conversion. Kirk's marriage to Annette produced 4 lovely daughters and a household that welcomed visitors from all over the world. These visitors would include the well-known and famous and important, but also unwed mothers with nowhere else to turn, and refugees from Africa, Vietnam, and Eastern Europe. Kirk, borrowing from Tolkien, called it the last homely house. Annette is still a force of nature these days and these decades later. Anyone who knows her realizes the legacy of Russell Kirk would not be nearly as well known were it not for her. For over 25 years after Dr. Kirk's death, she ran the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, now directed by her son-in-law, Jeffrey Nelson, and her daughter, Cecilia. And I will offer a self-serving plug and point you to my interview with Annette Kirk in Cultural Debris Podcast, Episode 30. But it's very interesting to get her perspective on these things. Cecilia, as it happened, posted just last night on Twitter a photo of Annette, 83 years old, speaking before a packed house at the Mecosta County Library about Russell Kirk. In January 1976, Kirk spoke at what was called the first national meeting, I assume the first Canadian national meeting, of the Chesterton Society in Saskatoon on the topic of Chesterton and T.S. Eliot. Now, one must be a very devoted enthusiast of G.K. Chesterton to travel to Saskatoon in January. If nothing else, this proves Kirk's Chesterton bona fides. Kirk himself had been friends with Eliot. Eliot had been his editor, and I quoted from an exchange earlier. And Kirk wrote a book on Eliot called Eliot and His Age. This talk turned into an essay published in the Chesterton Review, and it's interesting because Kirk seems to be considering this connection, or maybe lack of one, to Chesterton. Eliot and Chesterton were both men Kirk greatly admired. Why weren't they friends? Kirk writes, both found their own ways through solitary, sad experience to Christian faith. Both became Catholics, though not of the same communion. Both were champions of orthodoxy, tradition, continuity. Both were religious poets, though a gulf is fixed between the lines of Lepanto or the Ballad of the White Horse and the lines of the Wasteland or Ash Wednesday. Both smote well Shaw and Russell hip and thigh. Both expressed their contempt for the existing politicians and parties of Britain and for a society that denied the claims of imagination and beauty. The one wrote detective stories, the other relished and reviewed them, and was himself suspected unjustly of writing such under a pseudonym. Both edited London journals of literature and politics. Both were enthusiasts for the work of Edward Lear. And both were centric men, not eccentric. After a survey of Eliot's references and lack thereof to Chesterton, Kirk comes to the conclusion that Eliot seems to have regarded Chesterton as diminished by his departure from Canterbury. In other words, Eliot never embraced Chesterton, at least in part, because Chesterton had too enthusiastically embraced Rome. This Kirk bemoans. I think it somewhat strange that Eliot for many years spent much time with Leonard and Virginia Woolf, say, when he might have been in company with Chesterton in that handsome old inn at Beaconsfield. Ever the synthesizer, Kirk seeks to bring together his old friend in the flesh and his newer friend in the faith. However that may be, he writes, Chesterton and Eliot stood up manfully and eloquently, if scarcely shoulder to shoulder, for revealed truth, old loyalties, and the immoral imagination. Defying the spirit of the age, these two offer that communication of the dead tongued with fire which exceeds the language of the living. These last words from Eliot's 4 quartets are actually carved into Dr. Kirk's gravestone by special permission from his widow. Kirk would continue his embrace of Chesterton throughout the rest of his life. He would serve as an advisory editor for the Chesterton Review. He also adopted Chesterton's term democracy of the dead as a go-to phrase, much as Kirk used permanent things or sword of the imagination or the immoral imagination. He uses the term as an introduction to a chapter in his Viking Portable Conservative Reader in 1982, and it seems that Kirk wanted to include Chesterton in that anthology. He writes in the introduction to his chapter called The Fabulists, one would like, for instance, to include G.K. Chesterton's short story, The Yellow Bird, concerning a Russian anarchist professor who aspired to remove all limits. Kirk wrote to William F. Buckley when the book was released, apologizing for the omission of Buckley's essay on the Latin Mass. Kirk writes, along with Richard Weaver, James Fitzjames Stephen, G.K. Chesterton, John Hookham Freer, George Canning, and many other friends of mine, quick or dead, you were pushed out by Viking's demand that I reduce my selections by a third. As it was, the volume still reaches over 700 pages. That same decade, Kirk began speaking regularly at Washington's Heritage Foundation, and several of his later books are collections of those lectures. One such collection, Kirk titled, after one of his essays, "The Wise Men Know What Wicked Things Are Written on the Sky." Kirk begins that essay with a discussion of William Hogarth's engraving, The Bathos, which shows a chaotic scene at the end of the world. But then Kirk looks to Chesterton's The Ballad of the White Horse to ponder whether the fatalism that sees the inevitability of defeat or decline is warranted. Kirk writes he is letting some cheerfulness break in. Is the Eastern fatalism of the wise men in the poem right? Kirk, echoing Chesterton, says, no, the wicked things written on the sky are not inevitable. For it is not inevitable, he writes, that we submit ourselves to a social life and death of boring uniformity and equality. It is not inevitable that we indulge all our appetites to fatigue society. It is not inevitable that we reduce our schooling to the lowest common denominator. It is not inevitable that the computer should supplant the poet. It is not inevitable that obsession with creature comforts should sweep away beliefs in transcendent order. The answer, Kirk writes, is imagination. One thing we can do is this, to refrain from choking up the springs of the moral imagination. If we stifle the sense of wonder, no wonders will occur among us. Kirk also added the wise men line of the poem, as well as the term democracy of the dead, to later editions of the conservative mind. He began working Chesterton in those revisions. He writes in response to those wicked things that, quote, such champions of orthodoxy as Chesterton go gaily into the night. Of course, there are more writings by Kirk on Chesterton and many more references. Kirk wrote on Chesterton's journalism and also contributed to the introduction of volume 18 of the collected works of G.K. Chesterton from Ignatius Press. Alas, time prevents us from exploring all of those. A fortnight before Russell Kirk died, he gathered his household around him, his wife Annette and his family, as well as the young assistants working with him at the time. It was Easter Sunday, 1994. And with them gathered around him, he read to them from the Ballad of the White Horse, a poem that clearly loomed large in Kirk's thoughts in the last years of his life. The wise men know what wicked things are written on the sky. They trim sad lamps, they touch sad strings, and plot how God shall die. But you and all the kind of Christ are ignorant and brave, and you have wars you hardly win, and souls you hardly save. Night shall be thrice night over you, and heaven an iron cope. Do you have joy without cause, yea, faith without a hope? The men of the East may spell the stars and times and triumphs mark, but the men signed of the cross of Christ go gaily in the dark. As ever, Chesterton writes in paradox, his wise are the wise of the world, who shall eventually be brought low. The ignorant are the foolish of St. Paul. They are the ones who truly are wise, for regardless of what the signs of the times may seem to be, we are still men who can choose a different path. And we know we operate in God's creation for which he has paid a dear price, and he will not surrender it. And so King Alfred and G.K. Chesterton and Russell Kirk and St. Francis, too, call us to be fools for God, the ignorant and the brave, men of unfailing hope. For in so being, we become the true wise men, signed with the cross of Christ, going gaily in the dark, for we know morning's dawn must come. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for some questions. if anybody has any. If you do, that's okay. This is your chance. Yes, sir?
So, Kirk was a big fan of Kirk, Chesterton not so much. How do you
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that that's one of the reasons why in the early editions of the conservative mind, he places him a little bit outside of what he would consider the true descent of conservatism. You know, and I speak to you as not a Chesterton expert on the level of many of your speakers here, but my understanding is Chesterton came from a very different political background in his youth. He was not a Disraeli man by any means. He was a Gladstone man. And so I think that background probably colored Chesterton's own understanding and view of someone like Burke. More than anything else, Russell Kirk was a disciple of Edmund Burke. And to him, Edmund Burke, with his opposition to the French Revolution, was the defining moment of conservatism. That Burke was defending tradition and restraint during this time of madness. And so in Kirk's understanding, if thought didn't kind of operate within that line of descent in some way, then there was an issue with it, I guess. It wasn't what he would consider conservatism. That said, I think as time went on, and I think as he got to know Chesterton's writings better, he became more and more a devotee of Chesterton, as the references show. So one of the things that Kirk certainly would argue is that we shouldn't be ideologues, that everything doesn't have to match up. And so the last thing he would want to do is to turn Burke's own thought into an ideology, which would undermine the whole thing. So he liked variety, and it's hard to see how anybody who would write what Chesterton did about the democracy of the dead isn't within a Burkean understanding of tradition, I don't think.
Any others? You got a microphone coming? Microphone's coming.
Get my steps in.
Faster.
Oh, thanks so much. What a fantastic talk, and just
you.
great anecdotes. I especially enjoyed the anecdote about Flannery O'Connor. There's another story about the Anglican Church in the 1950s was rewriting or editing the Psalms for their psalm book to be used in liturgy, and one of their bishops had invited T.S. Eliot and also C.S. Lewis to be on this committee, and apparently the two didn't get along because I think C.S. Lewis had said something negative about Eliot's writing.
Yeah, he did.
And so I just offer that to you as an opportunity to maybe comment on that. I figured you would probably know something about that, and I just think it's interesting, these contemporary authors who didn't always see eye to eye, but they were all fantastic.
Right, I think that's exactly right. I don't know about that particular episode, but I do know that Lewis had been critical of Eliot's writing. Of course, Eliot burst onto the scene himself as a revolutionary innovator in poetry, and so his approach to poetry was not the traditional approach to poetry, even though he himself was a traditionalist. And I think that people like Chesterton and Lewis were sort of temperamentally put off by that kind of innovation. Kirk, coming later, could see it from a little bit more distance and could appreciate it, I think. Now, one of the criticisms that some made of the conservative mind was they were like, well, he's bringing in in a sense, kind of a hodgepodge of different thinkers, but that was kind of the point of the conservative mind. Dr. Kirk saying not all of these people are going to appear in their own time to necessarily even be on the same partisan side, but that's not the point. The point is that they're defending the traditions of the ages. And so I think he would say the same thing about Lewis, Chesterton, and Eliot, that at the time they may not have been friends or even appreciated each other fully for what they were doing, but that stepping back from them, we can see how they were doing what ought to be done. I mean, one of Dr. Kirk's favorite books that he actually recommended to Richard Nixon in the Oval Office was that he read T.S. Eliot's Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. Nixon said, "What's a book I should read?" He said, "Read this." And of course, that book draws heavily from Christopher Dawson, the great Catholic convert and historian of whom Dr. Kirk was also devoted. And so it's very easy to put together somebody like Chesterton and Lewis with somebody like Christopher Dawson, but at the same time, Eliot was very influenced by Dawson, but it's hard. But there's a kind of a gulf there between them, as Russell Kirk said. So I think perhaps sometimes we need a little bit of time to see the similarities that they themselves may not have been able to see.
One last question.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Can you extend that point just a little bit and tell us about how you are featuring different things on your podcast? Maybe plug your podcast a little bit.
I did not pay her to say that. But see me after. And so almost 3 years ago now, I started the Cultural Debris podcast, which the name Cultural Debris is stolen directly from a Russell Kirk essay, which that essay did make it into the Portable Conservative Reader because it was his. But it was an essay that was kind of an occasional essay. It wasn't, I guess, a major essay, but he obviously liked it himself because he did include it in the Portable Conservative Reader. And it was a term that always stuck with me. The idea in the essay is that it's like we're on a boat. We're searching for these things. Tom talked about how I was a thrifter. I like to go in search of cultural debris here and there, estate sales, that sort of thing. It's like we're on a boat after a shipwreck, finding all these things that have come to the surface and rescuing them. And that's kind of the way I envision a lot of what we're doing, right, is at a Chesterton conference in the Chesterton movement. But the podcast I started as an interview podcast. I interview a wide diversity of folks, including most recently a fellow named Dale Ahlquist, who was on to talk about G.K. Chesterton in this conference. We promoted that a little bit. But I've talked to a wide variety of people, artists in England. I've talked to a Habsburg, which is kind of incredible to me on the podcast. So it has given me the opportunity to talk to a wide number of people, but the idea is that it is informed by an appreciation of traditionalism and maintaining that thought and hopefully encouraging people to live that out in their lives. So you can listen to it on Apple or Spotify.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, sir.
All right.